Mara had lived alone in her apartment for almost 2 years before anything happened, and she was the first to admit she'd gotten comfortable in a way that probably wasn't smart. The apartment was on the second floor of a converted house in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of neighborhood that felt safe because it was old and familiar, because people had flower boxes on their porches and waved to each other in the mornings. She'd found it through a coworker who lived there before her, and it had the kind of worn, friendly character that made you feel held rather than trapped. The windows in her apartment were original to the house, which meant they were large, single pane, and not particularly well insulated. In winter, you could feel the cold radiating off them if you stood too close. But they faced a narrow strip of side yard, and then a wooden privacy fence. And beyond the fence was another quiet residential street. She'd never had reason to think about them much. She kept the curtains closed at night, mostly out of habit, and left them open during the day because the light was good in the afternoon. The first thing she noticed, the thing she didn't think anything of at the time, was the cat. Her upstairs neighbor kept a cat that sometimes got out onto the exterior staircase that ran along the side of the building. It was a gray tabby named something she could never remember, and she'd gotten used to seeing it on the landing outside her kitchen window sometimes, pressing its nose against the glass. She'd started leaving a small dish of water on the windowsill inside, even though she knew she probably shouldn't encourage it. Sometime in late October, she noticed the water dish was being knocked over at night. Not every night, maybe twice a week. She'd come into the kitchen in the morning, and there'd be a small puddle on the sill, and the dish would be tipped on its side or pushed to the edge. She figured the cat was being more aggressive about it, or maybe there were 2 visits happening, one she didn't know about. She didn't lose sleep over this. What she did lose sleep over, a few weeks later, was something harder to explain. She'd been working late, a Tuesday in November, and she got home around 11. The building was quiet. She came in, locked the door, put her bag down in the hallway, and went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. She didn't turn on the kitchen light immediately. The hallway light was on, and it threw enough glow through the doorway that she could see fine. She filled her glass at the sink and stood there drinking it. And then she looked at the window. The curtains were open. She always kept them closed at night. She was certain she'd closed them. That morning it had been a gray, cold day, and she remembered pulling them shut because she hadn't wanted to look at the damp fence all day while she got ready for work. She stood very still. She wasn't immediately frightened. She was confused. She went over the day in her head, trying to remember if she'd opened them at some point and forgotten. She couldn't think of a reason why she would have. She crossed to the window and pulled the curtains shut. She didn't look out. She told herself the curtains had probably just slipped back on. Their own. They were old, and the rod was slightly bowed, and sometimes the fabric did bunch unevenly. It was a reasonable explanation. She kept it. But over the next week, it happened 3 more times. Not every night, randomly. She would close the kitchen curtains before bed, and in the morning they would be open, or partially open, pulled back to one side. She started sleeping with her phone on the nightstand, which she hadn't done before. She'd always charged it in the living room. She told herself this was just a practical change, not a fearful one. She mentioned it to her upstairs neighbor in passing, asked if the cat had been getting out at night, whether it might somehow be getting in through the kitchen window. Her neighbor looked confused and said no. The cat had been inside every night, and also that the kitchen window was on the second floor over a narrow ledge that was barely 6 inches wide, so the cat would have to be the part mountain goat to get up there. That night, Mara pushed a chair against the kitchen window, not blocking it, just in front of it, so that if anything touched the curtains or the glass, the chair would move. In the morning, the chair was exactly where she'd left it. The curtains were still closed. She felt relieved. She felt a little foolish. She decided she'd been letting her imagination get ahead of her, and she put it out of her mind. 3 nights later, she woke up at 2:40 in the morning and lay in bed with that particular feeling of alertness that means some part of your brain registered something your conscious mind didn't. She lay still and listened. She couldn't hear anything unusual. She got up and walked to the kitchen, because that's where the feeling seemed to be pointed. The curtains were open. The chair was still in front of the window, The curtains were open. She stood in the kitchen doorway and her legs went cold. The window was closed and locked. She could see that from where she was standing. The curtains had simply been opened from the inside, pulled back to one side. She was standing in her kitchen at 2:40 in the morning, and her kitchen curtains had been opened in the night, and she had no explanation for it. She turned on every light in the apartment. She checked every door and every window. She was alone. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed except the curtains. She called her sister and stayed on the phone until 5 in the morning when it started getting light, and then she slept on the couch in the living room with her phone in her hand. The building manager came the next day and checked everything, the locks, the windows, the staircase. He showed her how the old kitchen window latch worked, demonstrated that it was secure. He was kind about it and tried not to be condescending. He said sometimes old curtains moved on their own with air pressure changes, with the heating system cycling on and off. He said the building was old and had quirks. She moved out 6 weeks later. She told people it was because she'd found a better place closer to work, which was true, but not the real reason. The real reason was that 2 weeks after the building manager's visit, she got up in the middle of the night and went to the kitchen and stood in the doorway and watched the curtains. For about 4 minutes, nothing happened. She was about to go back to bed and tell herself she was losing her mind. Then the curtain moved, slowly, from the inside. It slid about 8 inches to the left, as though someone had placed a hand behind it and just walked past. She turned on the light. She was alone. She never went back into that kitchen after dark. She ate everything cold, standing in the hallway, until the day she moved. She still doesn't know what was happening. She never found an explanation. The building manager told her after she left that the next tenant had no issues at all, and the tenant after that either. Whatever had been in that kitchen, if anything had been there at all, it was connected to her specifically, or it had decided to stop. She's not sure which possibility disturbs her more. The summer Daniel was 17, his family rented a lake house for 3 weeks in July. It was his parents and his younger sister and their dog, a big, slow retriever named Archie, who was going deaf and slept most of the time. The house had been recommended by a family friend and was cheap by lake house standards because it was on the unfashionable side of the lake, meaning you couldn't see the water from the front porch, and the beach was a 1/4-mile walk down a dirt path through pines. The house was fine, old, a little musty, the kind of vacation place where the kitchen drawers didn't quite close right, and there were hooks for coats in places that didn't make sense. And someone had left a watercolor of geese that had been hanging there for so long it had faded into the wallpaper. Daniel's room was at the back of the house, directly above the small utility porch. The window in his room faced the tree-lined pine forest that ran unbroken for what felt like miles. He'd open it at night because the house had no air conditioning, and it got stuffy after sundown. Through the screen, he could hear frogs and sometimes an owl and the general soft noise of a summer woods at night. He wasn't nervous about it. He was 17 and had never been particularly imaginative in the direction of fear. He slept well the first week. The second week started on a Sunday, and by Tuesday, something had changed. He couldn't put his finger on it at first. It was more like a quality of the air in the room at night, a kind of thickness to the quiet that hadn't been there before. He found himself lying awake longer than usual. He'd look at the ceiling for an hour before drifting off, and he couldn't explain why. He told himself it was the heat. Wednesday night, he was lying awake around midnight, and he noticed that Archie, who had taken to sleeping in his room in the cool from the open window, was sitting up. Archie never sat up at night. He was 11 years old and barely stirred unless someone stepped directly over him. But he was sitting up in the middle of the room, facing the window, completely still. Daniel watched the dog for a while. He told himself Archie was having a dream or had heard a deer or something. Eventually, the dog lay back down. Daniel fell asleep. Thursday, same thing. Archie sitting up in the dark, facing the window. Daniel got up and checked. He couldn't see anything outside. The tree line was about 40 feet from the house, and between the house and the trees, there was the overgrown backyard, long grass, an old picnic table with a collapsed leg, the rusted shell of a barbecue grill that had been there for years. Nothing moved. The frogs were loud. He went back to sleep. Friday night he stayed awake on purpose. He lay in his bed and watched the window. The screen was in, and the curtain, a thin cotton thing that barely moved, was pushed to one side because he liked the air. He watched for maybe 40 minutes, and his eyes were starting to feel heavy, and he thought this was pointless. And then he saw it. Movement at the tree line. Not dramatic movement, not an animal breaking from the trees or anything definite, just a shift, a vertical shape that was darker than the trees around it, and then a change in the geometry of the darkness, like something had stepped back between the trunks. He sat up. He kept looking. For a long time, nothing happened. The frogs continued. Archie was sitting up again, ears forward. Then the shape came out of the trees. It was a person. There was no question. The walk was human. The silhouette was human. The movement was human. Someone walking slowly across the backyard in the direction of the house. It was well after midnight. There were no neighbors for at least a quarter mile in any direction. The nearest house was back toward the road and had been empty since they'd arrived. This person was walking deliberately, without hurry, crossing the long grass toward the house. Daniel did not make a sound. He wasn't sure he was capable of making a sound. He lay back down on instinct, pure animal instinct, and pulled the sheet over himself and lay absolutely still, and he stared at the ceiling, and he listened. He heard footsteps in the grass. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. They stopped. He didn't know where they stopped. He didn't know how close. He lay still for what felt like an enormous amount of time, and the only sounds were the frogs, and eventually, Archie settling back down onto the floor. He didn't go to the window. He didn't call out. He didn't go wake his parents. He lay in that bed until the room started to get light, around 5 in the morning, and then he got up and looked out. The long grass was bent and flattened in a rough line from the tree line to the house. The line ended maybe 6 feet below his window. There were cigarette butts in the flattened area, more than one, like someone had been standing there for a while. He didn't tell his parents. He told himself 100 different things: a neighbor cutting through, someone out for a walk, a teenager from some nearby house he didn't know about. He tested each explanation, and none of them fully held up, and none of them fully fell apart. His family left Sunday as planned. He never went back to that house. His parents talked about renting it again the following summer, and he told them he hadn't liked it, and they didn't push. He thinks about those cigarette butts more than he thinks about the shape walking out of the trees. The shape could have been anything, in the dark, at a distance, but whoever had been standing beneath his window had been standing there long enough to smoke multiple cigarettes, long enough to need something to do with their hands, long enough to be patient. The last account comes from a woman named Priya, who was in her early 30s at the time, and working as a project coordinator for a small architectural firm. She's meticulous by nature and temperament, the kind of person who notices inconsistencies, who remembers numbers and sequences, who finds it difficult to let small wrongnesses go unexamined. This matters because the thing she noticed was exactly the kind of thing most people would have dismissed without a second thought. She lived in a townhouse in a mid-sized city, end unit, with a small garden out back that she'd actually managed to keep alive. Her home office was on the second floor, facing the front street. She worked from home 2 or 3 days a week and spent a lot of time at that window, not looking out deliberately, but looking up from her screen when she was thinking through a problem, the way you do. You accumulate a passive familiarity with what the street looks like, what cars park where, what the rhythm of the foot traffic is. She first noticed the man in the gray jacket sometime in March. She wasn't alarmed at first. He was just a man walking past. She clocked him because her eyes happened to come up from her screen as he went by. He was average height, gray jacket, walking at a normal pace, passing her window in the direction of the corner. She saw him again the next day. Same jacket, same direction. This time, she noticed him only because she'd noticed him the day before, that's all. The brain flags repetition. It means nothing on its own, but she kept seeing him, not every day, but multiple times a week, always on foot, always in that same jacket, always heading in the same direction. She started noting it without meaning to. She wasn't keeping a list, but her brain was keeping one for her. What eventually moved her from passive awareness to something else was a specific afternoon in early April. She was at her desk around 3 o'clock, and she saw him again. He was across the street, walking his usual direction, but this time, as he came level with her window, he stopped. He was looking at something on his phone. That's what it looked like. He stood on the sidewalk across the street and looked at his phone for maybe 30 seconds. Then he kept walking. Priya sat at her desk and felt something she couldn't quite name yet. She kept working, but that evening she pulled up the satellite view of her street on her computer and looked at the layout. Her window faced east. The sidewalk on the far side of the street was slightly elevated on a shallow berm common in older parts of that city, a relic of how the streets had been graded decades ago. From that sidewalk, at the elevation of the berm, you would have a very clean sight line into her second-floor window. She was not the kind of person who jumped to conclusions. She kept this thought at arm's length. The next week, she started paying different attention. She'd been looking at the man as a figure that walked past. Now she looked at his face when she could. She wanted to know whether he was looking at his phone or looking at her window. She couldn't tell from the angle. She was above and behind glass, and by the time she focused on his face, he had usually already moved past. She tried sitting differently, further back from the window, where the glass would reflect more of the sky and make it harder to see her. She wasn't sure if this helped. What she did confirm, over 2 more weeks, was that he wasn't just walking through, he lived there. She worked that out because she tracked, over time, his patterns both coming and going. She saw him sometimes heading in the other direction, earlier in the morning, and returning in the same direction she'd first noticed, in the early afternoon. He was coming from somewhere and going somewhere, and his route took him directly past her window, both times. She told herself this was completely ordinary, but then she started noticing the phone. He looked at his phone from the far sidewalk, directly across from her window, at irregular intervals. Not every time, maybe once every few days. He would stop, or slow significantly, and look at his phone for 15 to 30 seconds. He never appeared to be typing or scrolling. He was looking at something static. She thought about this for a long time before she reached the thought she'd been avoiding. She had a somewhat public professional profile. Her firm's website had a staff page with a photo, and her LinkedIn was moderately active. Her home address wasn't public, but her professional profile listed the firm's neighborhood. And if you were motivated and observant, a person might be able to narrow down where she lived through various small pieces of public information, an event she'd attended, a local business she'd reviewed online, the way social media location tagging worked. She thought about who might have that kind of motivation. She thought about difficult client interactions, about a brief and uncomfortable situation with a former colleague 2 years before that had resolved itself but never fully dissipated. She thought about whether she was being paranoid. She did not post anything online about her concerns. She told one friend, a careful, practical woman named Joe, who'd known her for 15 years. Joe listened without dramatizing it and asked practical questions. What did he actually do? He walked past and sometimes stopped. Had he ever approached her or made any contact? No. Had he ever done anything that a stranger watching would have identified as threatening? No. But Joe also said this: trust the pattern, not the individual incidents. Any single incident is nothing, but you've been watching this for weeks and you're still unsettled. That means something. Priya called the non-emergency police line and described the situation. The officer she spoke to was professional and not dismissive, which she'd been afraid of. He acknowledged that the pattern she was describing was worth noting, and he suggested she document it. Going forward, times, dates, descriptions, and callback if anything escalated. He told her she could always contact them again if she felt unsafe. She did document it. She kept a straightforward log date, approximate time, what she observed. No interpretation, just observation. She sent a copy of the log to Joe once a week. In the 3rd week of documentation, she managed to get a photograph.
Did you know a family once bought their dream home and never got to live?
At an angle, but clear
Did you know
enough
a
to show
family
the
once
jacket,
bought their
the
dream home
general
and never got
build,
to live in it?
and the fact that the phone,
You know a family
in this
once
particular instance, was pointed not at the sidewalk, but upward toward her window. She forwarded the photograph to the police and was told an officer would follow up. She doesn't know what, if anything, happened after that. She never received a follow-up call. She doesn't know whether anyone spoke to the man, whether he was ever identified, whether there was any determination made. What she does know is that after she submitted the photograph, she stopped seeing him. Not gradually, completely. He didn't come past anymore. Not the next day, not the week after, not in the weeks she continued watching, before she finally let herself stop keeping the log. She doesn't know whether that means the police reached him and he changed his route, or whether he noticed her taking the photograph and made the same decision himself, or whether it was a coincidence, which she considers the least likely of the three options. She told me the most unsettling part wasn't the stopping or looking at the phone or even the photograph. The most unsettling part was the length of time it had been happening before she noticed. She'd seen him regularly for weeks before the pattern registered consciously. How many weeks before that had he been walking past? There's no way to know.
Did you know?
That's the part she can't let go of. That her window had probably been a part of someone's routine for a period of time she can't measure, can't reclaim, can't fully understand. The glass was between them. She felt safe behind it, but the glass was working only in one direction. She could see a man walking a sidewalk. What he could see from that slight elevation across the street, at that angle into her lit office window every afternoon, was something different altogether. She's since installed privacy film on her office windows. It looks like mirrored glass from the outside. You can see out perfectly well from the inside, but from the street, it reflects the sky. She says the work environment is actually nicer now, less glare on the screen, and she likes being able to look out without thinking about what comes back through the glass in the other direction. She says she should have done it years ago. She probably should have. Most of us should.